She walked into that chamber thinking she was untouchable. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the social media phenomenon, the progressive darling, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. She'd conquered Twitter, dominated headlines, built a movement, but she'd never faced anyone like Senator John Kennedy. And what happened in the next 5 minutes would change everything. The date was March 12, 2019. The Senate Budget Committee had convened to discuss the Green New Deal, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's ambitious proposal to transform the American economy and combat climate change. AOC had been invited to testify, and she'd accepted eagerly. This was her chance to bring her message to the Senate, to prove she belonged among the power brokers in Washington, to show that she wasn't just a social media celebrity but a serious legislator with serious ideas. She'd spent days preparing. Her staff had compiled binders full of statistics about carbon emissions, renewable energy potential, job creation projections. They'd crafted talking points about environmental justice, about the moral imperative of bold action, about how the greatest generation had mobilized for World War II, and her generation needed to mobilize for the climate crisis. AOC had practiced her testimony in front of mirrors, perfecting her delivery, her passion, her righteous anger at the political establishment that refused to act with urgency. What she hadn't prepared for was John Kennedy. The 72-year-old Republican senator from Louisiana didn't look like much of a threat. With his rumpled suits that never quite fit right, his thick Southern accent that made every word sound like it was being poured out of a jar of molasses, his self-deprecating manner that suggested he was just a simple man trying to keep up with all these smart folks from fancy cities. He had this way of introducing himself to witnesses that made him seem almost apologetic for taking up their time. "I'm just a country lawyer from Louisiana," he'd say with a warm smile. "I'm trying to understand all this complicated policy you brilliant people are discussing." It was an act, a carefully crafted, devastatingly effective act. What most people didn't know, what AOC's team apparently hadn't researched, was that John Kennedy was a Rhodes Scholar. He'd studied at Oxford University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. He had a law degree from the University of Virginia, one of America's elite law schools. Before entering politics, he'd spent decades as a lawyer, honing his skills in cross-examination, learning how to trap hostile witnesses with their own words, mastering the art of asking questions that seemed simple but were actually carefully designed traps. The simple country lawyer routine was theater. Political theater performed by a brilliant legal mind who knew exactly what he was doing. And he'd used it to destroy witness after witness in congressional hearings, making them look foolish while never raising his voice, never being impolite, never doing anything that could be criticized as unfair or aggressive. Kennedy had prepared for this hearing the way a trial lawyer prepares for a crucial cross-examination. The morning of the hearing, he'd sat in his office with his senior staff members, going through every public statement AOC had ever made about the Green New Deal. Every tweet, every interview, every speech, every casual comment caught on video. They were looking for claims she couldn't back up, assertions made without evidence, promises that sounded good but hadn't been thought through. They found plenty. His chief of staff had compiled what they called the simple questions list. Just basic, fundamental questions that any serious policy proposal should be able to answer easily. How much does this cost? How many jobs will it actually create, not in theory but in practice? How will you pay for it, specifically, with real numbers? If you eliminate fossil fuels, where will the electricity come from during the transition? What happens to the millions of people whose jobs disappear? These weren't gotcha questions designed to embarrass someone with obscure technical details. These were the most basic questions anyone proposing to transform the entire American economy should have ready answers for. Kennedy knew this. His staff knew this. And they suspected AOC didn't have those answers. They suspected she had passion and talking points and social media engagement strategies, but not actual policy details, not real numbers, not implementation plans that could survive serious scrutiny. They were about to find out if they were right. The Senate Budget Committee hearing room was packed that morning. 200 people filled the seats, journalists with their laptops open, camera crews positioning their equipment, lobbyists representing various interest groups, citizens who'd managed to get passes to watch what everyone expected to be high political drama. The room had that distinctive Washington atmosphere, all dark wood paneling and portraits of long-dead senators staring down from the walls, the weight of political history pressing down on everyone present. C-SPAN cameras were positioned at multiple angles, ensuring that every moment would be captured for the permanent record, available forever for anyone who wanted to watch. In the age of viral video and social media, these cameras meant that whatever happened in this room could reach millions of people within hours. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered the hearing room and took her seat at the witness table. She was 34 years old, wearing a professional outfit that managed to look both congressional and fashionable, the kind of carefully chosen clothing that had made her a style icon among young progressives. Her signature red lipstick was perfectly applied. Her hair was styled professionally. She looked confident, even excited. This was her stage, her moment to defend her vision on national television, to show all the old guard politicians who dismissed her as just a young upstart that she understood policy, that she'd done her homework, that she belonged here. The hearing began with the usual political theater. Committee members gave opening statements, Democrats praising AOC for her bold vision and moral courage on climate change, Republicans expressing skepticism about the costs and feasibility of such dramatic economic transformation. It was all predictable, choreographed, the kind of partisan positioning that happens at every high-profile hearing. AOC sat through it all looking composed, occasionally nodding when Democratic senators said supportive things, maintaining a carefully neutral expression when Republicans criticized her proposal. She'd been coached on how to handle this part. Don't react visibly to criticism. Look professional. Look like you belong here. Then the chairman recognized Senator Kennedy for 5 minutes of questioning. Kennedy smiled warmly at AOC as he shuffled some papers in front of him, taking his time, projecting the image of a kindly older gentleman who just wanted to have a friendly conversation about policy. When he finally spoke, his Louisiana accent was thick and slow, each word taking its sweet time to emerge. Miss Ocasio-Cortez, thank you so much for being here today. I truly appreciate you taking the time to testify before our committee. I know you're a busy woman with a lot of demands on your time. AOC smiled and nodded. Thank you, Senator. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Kennedy's smile got even warmer, like he was talking to his favorite granddaughter. I've been reading about your Green New Deal proposal, and I have to say, it sounds mighty ambitious. Transforming our entire economy, rebuilding every building in America, getting to net zero emissions in 10 years. That's quite an undertaking you're proposing. He paused, as if genuinely impressed by the scope of her vision. So I hope you can help me out here because I'm just a simple country lawyer from Louisiana, and some of this is a bit over my head. But I'm trying to understand the scope of what we're talking about. What does all this cost? Just a ballpark figure so I can wrap my mind around it. The question sounded innocent enough, almost friendly, just a curious senator trying to understand the basics. AOC should have recognized the trap. Anyone who'd studied Kennedy's questioning style would have seen it coming. But she didn't. She launched into her prepared talking points about how you can't put a price tag on saving the planet, about how the cost of inaction on climate change would be far higher than any investment in addressing it, about how this was really an investment in America's future rather than an expense to be worried about. Kennedy listened patiently, nodding along with that grandfatherly expression on his face. He didn't interrupt. He let her talk, and when she paused to take a breath, he jumped in with that same gentle tone. Ma'am, I appreciate all that. I really do. Climate change is serious. Nobody's arguing that, but I'm asking a simpler question if you don't mind. He held up his hand and started counting on his fingers like he was trying to work through a basic math problem. What does your plan cost? You've proposed it. You've asked the American people to support it. You must have some idea of the numbers we're talking about. Just help me understand. Is it $10 trillion, $20 trillion, $50 trillion? What's the ballpark? AOC shifted slightly in her seat. This wasn't going the way she'd expected. The costs haven't been fully calculated yet because we're still in the proposal phase. Different economists have different estimates depending on their assumptions about. So you don't know, Kennedy interrupted gently. That's what I'm hearing. You've proposed transforming the entire American economy, but you can't tell us what it costs. Is that accurate? I'm saying the estimates vary widely, but you don't have a number. Kennedy's smile never wavered, but his voice took on a slightly sharper edge while remaining perfectly polite. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You want to rebuild every building in America. You want to replace every car with an electric vehicle. You want to completely change how we generate electricity. You want to transform agriculture. And you're asking the American people to support this massive change. But when I ask what it costs, you don't have an answer. He paused, letting that sink in. The room was very quiet now. The journalists were leaning forward. The cameras were focused on AOC's face. She looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, when I go to the hardware store back home in Louisiana and I tell them I want to renovate my house, you know what the first thing they ask me is? They ask me what my budget is. Because you can't renovate a house without knowing what you can afford to spend. Seems to me that's something you might want to figure out before proposing the biggest economic transformation in American history. AOC's cheeks flushed slightly. Senator, with all due respect, the climate crisis demands bold action. We can't let concerns about cost prevent us from. I'm not trying to prevent anything, Kennedy said, his tone remaining gentle but firm. I'm just trying to understand what we're being asked to support. You're a member of Congress. You have an economics degree from Boston University. Is that right? Yes. Well then, surely you understand that before you spend money, you need to know how much money you're spending. That's basic economics, isn't it? But you can't tell us. That concerns me, ma'am. That should concern every American watching this. You're asking us to support the biggest spending program in human history, and you don't know what it costs. AOC tried to recover. Multiple think tanks have studied this. The costs depend on implementation details that. Those think tanks came up with numbers between $50 trillion and $93 trillion over 10 years. Kennedy said, no longer playing quite as dumb. That's what they estimated. But you've dismissed those estimates as missing the point. So I'm asking you, what is the cost? Not what think tanks say. What do you say? The silence that followed was uncomfortable. AOC didn't have an answer. Everyone in that room, everyone watching on C-SPAN, could see she didn't have an answer. She had passion and conviction, but not numbers. She had a vision, but not a plan. Kennedy let the silence sit for a moment longer than necessary, then moved on to his next question, already knowing he'd scored his first major point. Let me ask you about something else if you don't mind. Amazon wanted to build their second headquarters in New York City. 25,000 jobs, they said. Good-paying jobs, too. But you opposed it, and they decided to go elsewhere. Can you walk me through your thinking on that? I'm trying to understand the economics of turning down 25,000 jobs. AOC sat up straighter, clearly feeling she was on firmer ground here. This was a fight she'd won, or at least she thought she had. Amazon was asking for nearly $3 billion in tax breaks and subsidies. That's $3 billion that could have been better spent on our communities, on education, on infrastructure that benefits everyone, not just one corporation. Kennedy nodded along like he was following her logic. So the tax breaks could be better spent. That's what you said at the time, isn't it? That money could be spent elsewhere. Yes, exactly. Help me understand that, Kennedy said, leaning forward slightly, maintaining his curious grandfather demeanor. Tax breaks. That's when you don't collect taxes you normally would, correct? You're agreeing not to collect certain taxes in exchange for some benefit, right? Yes, but... So, ma'am, if Amazon doesn't come, do you get that money to spend? Kennedy's question was delivered so gently, it took a moment for the trap to become apparent. AOC hesitated. The city wouldn't be giving away $3 billion that could be used for. That's not what I asked, Kennedy said, still smiling but pressing the point. I asked if Amazon doesn't come, do you get that money to spend on other things? Yes or no? The tax structure would be different if, yes or no, ma'am. Simple question. If Amazon doesn't build their headquarters in New York, does the city have $3 billion to spend on schools or infrastructure or anything else? The silence stretched out. Everyone could see AOC was struggling with the question because she was realizing, possibly for the first time, that her understanding of the Amazon deal had been fundamentally wrong. No, she finally admitted quietly. No, Kennedy repeated, his voice still gentle but now with an edge of teaching. Because, see, I think there's been some confusion about how tax breaks work. A tax break isn't money you have sitting in a bank account that you can choose to spend on something else. It's money you agree not to collect in the future. If the company doesn't come, you don't get to collect that money at all. You get zero. Does that make sense? AOC looked frustrated now. The point is that Amazon was asking for corporate welfare while, let's do some simple math together, Kennedy interrupted, and he actually pulled out a pen and paper like he was going to work through a basic arithmetic problem. Amazon said they'd bring $27 billion in economic activity over time. The tax breaks were worth $3 billion. So that's $27 billion minus $3 billion. What does that equal? $24 billion, AOC said quietly. $24 billion, Kennedy repeated, writing it down on his paper and holding it up like a teacher showing the class. That's how much New York would have gained even after the tax breaks. But Amazon left. So how much does New York get now? He paused, waiting for her to say it. Nothing, AOC admitted. Zero, Kennedy said, writing a big zero on his paper and holding it up. You turned $24 billion into zero. 25,000 jobs into zero. All that tax revenue into zero. And you did it because you thought tax breaks were money sitting in a bank account that could be spent elsewhere. He paused, letting that sink in. You got an economics degree from Boston University, right? Very prestigious school. Probably cost your parents about $60,000 a year. And they didn't teach you the difference between tax breaks and government spending. The room was dead silent except for the sound of cameras clicking and the faint hum of C-SPAN equipment. AOC looked like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Kennedy's voice became even more gentle, which somehow made it worse. Ma'am, I'm just a simple lawyer from Louisiana, but even I know that $24 billion is better than zero. Those were real jobs for real families, real tax revenue for New York's schools and infrastructure, real economic activity, and you chased it all away because you didn't understand basic economics. He shuffled his papers, preparing to move on. Those families who would have had those good-paying jobs, they're not better off because of your decision. New York isn't better off, but I guess you felt good about sticking it to Amazon, and maybe that's what matters to you. The implication hung in the air. She'd prioritized feeling righteous over actually helping people. Kennedy looked at his notes like he was just remembering something. Oh, one more thing that's been bothering me. Maybe you can clear this up. I heard you say once that unemployment is low because everyone has two jobs. Did I hear that right? AOC sighed. That statement has been taken out of context. What I meant was, did you say it? Kennedy asked simply. I'm not asking about context yet. Did you say that unemployment is low because everyone has two jobs? Yes, but the point I was making. Help me understand the math on that, Kennedy said, and he actually pulled out a calculator from his jacket pocket like he was going to work through it. If I have two jobs, how many times am I counted in the unemployment statistics? AOC could see where this was going. Once. Once, Kennedy repeated. If Senator Durbin over there has two jobs, he's counted once. If everyone in this room has two jobs, they're each counted once. So having two jobs doesn't make unemployment look lower, does it? That's not how unemployment is calculated. The broader point I was making was about wages and the cost of living. Ma'am, I understand you might have been trying to make a broader point, but your statement was specifically about unemployment. You said unemployment is low because people have two jobs. That's mathematically impossible. If I work at the grocery store in the morning and drive for Uber at night, the Bureau of Labor Statistics counts me as one employed person with two jobs, not two employed people. So that cannot be why unemployment is low. You see what I'm saying? Kennedy's tone was so patient, so gentle, like he was explaining basic arithmetic to a child who was struggling with homework. It made AOC's error seem all the more glaring. "I misspoke," AOC said defensively. "Everyone makes mistakes." "That's fair," Kennedy nodded. "Everyone does make mistakes. But ma'am, you have an economics degree from Boston University. Your parents spent probably $240,000 on that education. And you don't know how unemployment statistics are calculated. That's not misspeaking. That's not knowing something fundamental to economics. And that concerns me because you're proposing huge changes to our economy. If you don't know how unemployment works, how can we trust your judgment on economic policy?" AOC looked angry now rather than embarrassed. "Senator, I think it's clear you're just trying to make me look bad rather than having a genuine conversation about." "I'm not trying to make you look bad," Kennedy said, his voice still maddeningly polite. "I'm just asking simple questions. You made a statement about unemployment that was factually wrong. That's not me making you look bad. That's me asking you to explain a statement you made. If you can't explain it, that's not my fault." He glanced at his papers. "I've still got a couple minutes. Let's keep going. You support Medicare for all, is that correct?" "Yes, healthcare is a human right, and—" "I agree healthcare is important," Kennedy interrupted gently. "But let's talk about the economics of it, because that's what we're here to discuss today. Studies estimate Medicare for all would cost about $32 trillion over 10 years. That's about $3.2 trillion per year. How do we pay for that?" AOC launched into talking points about taxing the wealthy and corporations, about the savings from eliminating private insurance overhead, about how other countries manage to provide universal health care. Kennedy listened with that patient expression, then held up his hand. "Let me stop you there. Let's do the math together if you don't mind." He pulled out his paper and pen again. "All the billionaires in America combined are worth about $4.6 trillion. That's their total wealth. If we confiscated every penny they have, which we can only do once because then they'd have nothing left, that's $4.6 trillion. But Medicare for all costs $32 trillion over 10 years. So that's $4.6 trillion toward a $32 trillion cost. Where does the other $27.4 trillion come from? Corporate taxes, wealth taxes on the very wealthy, eliminating subsidies for—" "Ma'am," Kennedy interrupted, still gently, "even if we taxed every corporation in America at 100% of their profits, meaning they got to keep nothing, and we taxed every single person making over $100,000 a year at 100%, meaning they worked for free, we still couldn't pay for this. The math doesn't work. I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just asking where the money comes from. Real answer, not talking points." AOC looked frustrated. "Other countries make it work. Canada, the UK, European countries. Other countries don't have our population," Kennedy said, counting points on his fingers. "They don't spend what we spend on defense because we defend them. They have different healthcare systems than what you're proposing. And most importantly, I'm not asking about other countries. I'm asking about your plan for America. Where does the $32 trillion come from? Show me the math." The silence that followed was uncomfortable for everyone except Kennedy, who sat there patiently waiting for an answer he knew wouldn't come. "The details would need to be worked out," AOC finally said. "The details," Kennedy repeated. "Ma'am, the cost is not a detail. The cost is pretty much the most important thing. You're proposing the biggest expansion of government in American history, and you're telling me the details of how to pay for it need to be worked out. That's like me going to the bank and asking for a loan to buy a house, and when they ask me how I plan to pay it back, I say, 'Oh, those details need to be worked out.' The bank wouldn't give me that loan. Why should the American people give you $32 trillion without knowing how you'll pay for it?" His time was almost up, but he pressed one more point. "See, this is a pattern I'm noticing. Green New Deal, you don't know what it costs. Medicare for all, you don't know how to pay for it. Amazon, you didn't understand basic tax policy. Unemployment, you didn't know how it's calculated, and you have an economics degree. You're in Congress making economic policy. This concerns me, ma'am. It should concern every American watching." Kennedy glanced at the clock. He had about 90 seconds left in his 5 minutes. Let me ask about your record real quick. You've been in Congress for about 3 years now. What major legislation have you successfully passed into law? AOC looked caught off guard by the change in direction. I've introduced important legislation. I've shifted the national conversation on issues like. I asked what you've passed, Kennedy said simply. Bills that became law, major accomplishments, what's your list? The Green New Deal has fundamentally changed how we discuss climate policy. The Green New Deal got 0 votes in the Senate, Kennedy interrupted. When it came up for a vote, not a single senator voted for it, not even Democrats. In the House, your own party wouldn't bring it to the floor for a full vote because they knew it would fail. So that's not passed legislation. That's a failed proposal. What else? AOC tried to pivot to talking about amendments she'd introduced, about hearings she'd participated in, about raising awareness on important issues. Kennedy let her talk for a moment, then cut back in. Ma'am, raising awareness is what social media influencers do. You're a member of Congress. Congress passes laws. That's the job. Write bills, get them through committee, pass them in the House, hope the Senate passes them, President signs them. That's legislating. How many bills have you gotten through that process? The answer was obvious from AOC's silence. None. She'd passed nothing of significance. 3 years in Congress, Kennedy said, not bothering to hide his point anymore. 0 major legislation passed into law, but you have millions of Twitter followers, so I guess that's something. Except Twitter is not the same as governing. Tweeting is not the same as legislating. And being famous is not the same as being effective. He gathered his papers as his time expired. Mr. Chairman, I think I'm out of time, but I appreciate Ms. Ocasio-Cortez's testimony today. It's been very illuminating. The chairman thanked Kennedy and moved to recognize the next senator, but Kennedy held up his hand. Mr. Chairman, if I could have just 30 more seconds to make a final point. The chairman nodded. Kennedy turned to look at AOC, his expression becoming slightly less grandfatherly and slightly more serious, though still fundamentally respectful in tone. Miss Ocasio-Cortez, I want to thank you for your testimony today. I mean that sincerely. You've been very revealing, just not in the way you probably intended. He paused to let that land. You came here to tell us about your Green New Deal and why we should support it. But when I asked you what it costs, you couldn't tell me. When I asked you about the Amazon decision, you showed you don't understand the difference between tax breaks and government spending. When I asked about unemployment, you showed you don't know how unemployment is calculated. When I asked about Medicare for all, you couldn't show me the math for how to pay for it. And when I asked about your legislative record, you couldn't name a single major accomplishment. Kennedy's voice remained gentle, but his words were devastating. Now I think you're a talented communicator. You're very good on social media. You know how to get attention and get people excited. Those are real skills, but they're not governing skills. They're marketing skills. He picked up his papers slowly, not rushing. There's a big difference between sounding smart and being smart, between talking about big ideas and knowing how to implement them, between tweeting and legislating. Today, you've shown us which side of those divides you're on. Kennedy stood up, maintaining that courteous Southern gentleman demeanor even while delivering what everyone recognized as a thorough destruction. I'm just a simple country lawyer from Louisiana, but I know this much. Before you propose transforming the entire American economy, you should probably know what it costs. Before you lecture people about economics, you should probably understand basic economic concepts. Before you tell other people to pay more taxes, you probably shouldn't attend $35,000 parties wearing dresses that say tax the rich. And before you ask Americans to trust your judgment, you should probably pass some actual legislation that shows you know what you're doing. He smiled one last time, but it was different now. Less grandfather, more lawyer who just won his case. Miss Ocasio-Cortez, I hope you'll go back and do your homework. Figure out what things actually cost. Learn how policies work in practice, not just in theory. Pass some legislation that helps real people. Because right now, you're all talk and no substance. And the American people deserve better than bartender economics from someone with a fancy degree who doesn't understand it. Kennedy nodded to the chairman. "I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman." The room erupted. Republicans were applauding enthusiastically. Democrats looked uncomfortable, many of them clearly agreeing with Kennedy even if they couldn't say so publicly. AOC sat at the witness table looking stunned, angry, and humiliated all at once. She'd come expecting to give inspiring testimony about her vision for America. Instead, a 72-year-old senator with a Southern accent had made her look completely unprepared, using nothing but simple questions delivered with unfailing politeness. And the entire thing was on C-SPAN forever, permanently archived for anyone to watch, whenever they wanted to see what happens when Twitter popularity meets actual policy knowledge. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within 12 hours of the hearing ending, the full 5 minutes of Kennedy questioning AOC had been viewed 38 million times across YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and various news websites that embedded the C-SPAN footage. By the 48-hour mark, that number had exploded to over 65 million. Within a week, over 100 million people had watched some version of the exchange, making it one of the most viewed congressional hearing clips in the history of C-SPAN. What made the video spread far beyond typical partisan circles was the nature of Kennedy's questioning and AOC's responses. He hadn't engaged in personal attacks. He hadn't raised his voice even once. He hadn't been disrespectful or dismissive in his tone. He'd simply asked basic, straightforward questions that any serious policy proposal should be able to answer. What does this cost? How do you pay for it? Can you explain how this policy works in practice? These weren't gotcha questions designed to trap her with obscure details or trick wording. They were fundamental questions about implementation and cost that anyone proposing to transform the American economy should have ready answers for. And AOC, despite her economics degree from Boston University, despite her 3 years in Congress, despite her millions of Twitter followers and her status as one of the most famous progressives in America, couldn't answer them. That wasn't Kennedy being mean or unfair. That was AOC being unprepared, and millions of Americans watching could see the difference clearly. The "just a simple country lawyer" phrase became an instant cultural phenomenon. Video editors on YouTube and TikTok created elaborate compilation videos showing Kennedy using that humble self-description before proceeding to systematically demolish witnesses with his supposedly simple questions. The compilations would show his educational credentials: Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, University of Virginia Law, next to footage of him playing the friendly grandfather from Louisiana who was just trying to understand all this complicated stuff. The contrast between his actual brilliance and his performed simplicity became a source of endless entertainment and admiration, particularly among younger conservatives who'd never paid much attention to Senate hearings before. One particularly viral video intercut Kennedy's questioning of AOC with clips of him questioning other progressive witnesses in previous hearings, all following the same pattern. Start with the humble country lawyer routine. Ask seemingly simple questions. Watch the witness struggle to answer. Maintain perfect politeness throughout. End with devastating summations delivered in that slow Louisiana drawl. The video, titled "Senator Kennedy Being a Savage for 10 Minutes Straight," got 43 million views and introduced Kennedy to an entirely new generation of political watchers who'd thought congressional hearings were boring. Conservative media outlets played the exchange on an endless loop, but they did so in ways that emphasized different aspects of Kennedy's technique. Fox News ran segments with legal experts analyzing his questioning style as a masterclass in cross-examination. They brought on law professors who taught trial advocacy to explain how Kennedy had used classic courtroom techniques to box AOC in, making it impossible for her to escape without either answering the question or looking evasive. Sean Hannity dedicated an entire monologue to the exchange, praising Kennedy for doing what he called the job journalists should be doing, asking basic questions and demanding actual answers instead of accepting talking points. Talk radio hosts across the country played the audio of the exchange, sometimes multiple times per show. Rush Limbaugh, in one of his final broadcasts before his death, called it the most devastating 5 minutes of congressional testimony I've ever heard, and praised Kennedy for exposing what he saw as the fundamental emptiness of progressive policy proposals. Local conservative radio hosts in markets across America used clips from the hearing as intro music or bumpers, making Kennedy's voice and questioning style familiar to millions of regular radio listeners who might never have watched C-SPAN. But the impact wasn't limited to conservative media. Mainstream outlets found themselves unable to ignore the story because the viewing numbers were simply too massive. CNN covered it extensively, though their analysis tried to be more sympathetic to AOC. Their segments featured progressive commentators who argued that Kennedy had been condescending and dismissive, that his simple country lawyer routine was itself a kind of disrespect, that he was using his experience and position to intimidate a younger colleague. Some CNN analysts suggested that demanding specific cost figures was a bad faith tactic designed to make any ambitious policy proposal look irresponsible. These defenses mostly fell flat because anyone could watch the actual video and see Kennedy being unfailingly polite. His tone never became mocking or cruel. He never called AOC names or questioned her intelligence directly. He just asked questions and waited for answers. The fact that she couldn't provide good answers wasn't his fault. It was hers. And most viewers, even those who might be sympathetic to progressive policies in general, could see that distinction clearly. MSNBC's coverage was more divided. Some hosts defended AOC and criticized Kennedy, but others, particularly those with more moderate political leanings, acknowledged that her performance had been problematic. One MSNBC analyst, speaking on background to reporters afterward, admitted that she walked into a trap, but it was a trap she built herself by not doing the basic homework. Another said privately that many Democrats in Congress were frustrated with AOC for making the party look unprepared and giving Republicans such easy ammunition. The exchange had immediate and specific policy impacts that went beyond just damaging AOC's personal brand. The Green New Deal, which had already been struggling to gain traction among mainstream Democrats worried about its costs and feasibility, became completely toxic politically after Kennedy's questioning. Democrats running in competitive House and Senate races wanted nothing to do with it. When asked about climate policy during campaigns, they'd talk in general terms about supporting renewable energy development, investing in clean technology, and reducing emissions over time. But they studiously avoided mentioning AOC's specific Green New Deal proposal by name. The fact that its most prominent advocate couldn't answer basic questions about cost and implementation made association with it politically dangerous. Campaign strategists working for moderate Democrats began actively advising their candidates to distance themselves from AOC and her policy proposals. Internal polling showed that in swing districts, AOC's brand had become a liability rather than an asset. After the Kennedy hearing, voters in these districts, including many who identified as Democrats, found Kennedy's questions compelling and AOC's inability to answer them troubling. They wanted bold action on climate change, but they also wanted to know it was financially feasible and well-planned. Kennedy had raised reasonable doubts about whether AOC's proposal met those criteria. Medicare for All, while not specifically AOC's legislation, also suffered collateral damage from the exchange. Kennedy's simple question about how to pay for $32 trillion resonated powerfully with voters who supported universal health care in principle, but worried about the practical realities of implementation and cost. Progressive candidates who'd been campaigning on Medicare for All found themselves facing more skeptical questions from voters and journalists who wanted specific answers about funding mechanisms. The days of being able to advocate for it purely on moral grounds without defending the economics were over. Kennedy had made the details matter in a way they hadn't before. The Amazon example became particularly damaging to AOC's credibility on economic issues, because Kennedy had explained the difference between tax breaks and government spending in terms that anyone could understand, even people without any economic training. The fact that AOC, who held an economics degree from a prestigious university, hadn't understood that difference made her look either genuinely ignorant about basic concepts or deliberately dishonest in how she'd characterized the Amazon deal. Either interpretation was politically damaging. Defenders of the Amazon deal in New York, many of whom had been attacked and called corporate shills when they'd opposed AOC's campaign against it, felt vindicated. They'd been saying all along that killing the deal would cost New York jobs and tax revenue. Kennedy had made that argument in the starkest possible terms. She'd turned $24 billion into zero. Local New York news outlets revisited the Amazon story with renewed interest, interviewing economic development experts who explained in detail what the city had lost and why AOC's understanding of tax policy had been flawed. Perhaps most significantly for AOC personally, her entire political brand took a major hit that would prove difficult to recover from. She'd built her persona on being the smart young progressive who was going to shake up the establishment with bold new ideas backed by intellectual rigor. The economics degree from Boston University was part of that brand. The quick wit and confident assertions were part of that brand. The image of someone who'd done her homework and knew what she was talking about was central to how she'd presented herself. Kennedy's 5 minutes of simple questions had shattered that image completely. He'd exposed that maybe she was young and bold and good at social media, but not actually that well-informed when it came to the details of policy implementation. Maybe she was better at generating Twitter engagement than at actual governing. Maybe the economics degree was just a credential that didn't translate to practical understanding. Maybe the confidence was actually overconfidence masking a lack of real preparation. For weeks afterward, anytime AOC gave a speech or did an interview, someone would inevitably ask her to clarify costs or provide specific numbers. She clearly hated it. She'd gotten used to speaking in broad, inspirational terms about what needed to be done without having to defend the details of how. Kennedy had made details matter again. He'd shown that passion and conviction aren't substitutes for actual policy knowledge. Kennedy himself became a viral sensation in a way that surprised many people who didn't normally follow congressional proceedings. Young conservatives started sharing his questioning techniques as models for how to debate progressives. Just ask them what it costs became a standard response to ambitious progressive proposals. Show me the math started appearing on t-shirts and memes. Kennedy's office was flooded with requests for him to question other progressive politicians using his signature style. He leaned into it. In subsequent hearings, he'd make a point of asking similar simple questions of other witnesses advocating expensive progressive policies. The simple country lawyer routine became his brand, and it was devastatingly effective because he'd proven it worked. He could make smart people who hadn't done their homework look foolish without ever being rude or losing his temper. 6 months after the hearing, AOC's polling numbers showed the damage. Her favorability ratings had dropped 12 points among independents. Even among Democrats, while she remained popular with the progressive base, more moderate party members increasingly saw her as a liability rather than an asset. The video of Kennedy's questioning became standard opposition research material that would be used against her in future campaigns. More importantly, AOC seemed genuinely rattled by the experience in a way that changed her public behavior. She became notably more cautious about making specific policy claims. She relied more heavily on prepared statements and talking points. When doing interviews, she'd steer away from detailed policy discussions toward broader values-based arguments. The confidence and swagger that had marked her early years in Congress was tempered by what appeared to be a recognition that she'd been exposed on a very public stage. The ultimate irony was that Kennedy's performance wasn't particularly complex or difficult to replicate. He hadn't used some sophisticated rhetorical technique that required years of training to master. He just asked simple questions and insisted on getting answers. Any competent questioner could do the same thing if they prepared properly and had the courage to press for actual responses instead of accepting talking points. That's what made the whole exchange so memorable and so damaging. It wasn't that Kennedy had done something extraordinary. It was that answering his questions should have been ordinary, routine, expected from anyone proposing major legislation. The fact that AOC couldn't do it revealed a fundamental lack of preparation, an understanding that no amount of media savvy or Twitter followers could compensate for. This wasn't a debate between competing policy visions. This was a Rhodes Scholar disguised as a country lawyer exposing a bartender with an economics degree she didn't understand. This was preparation meeting popularity and revealing the difference. John Kennedy had spent hours going through AOC's public statements, identifying claims she'd made without evidence, finding assertions she couldn't back up. He'd prepared simple questions that any serious policymaker should be able to answer. He'd practiced his delivery, perfecting that folksy Southern gentleman routine that made people underestimate him right up until the moment they realized they'd been trapped. AOC had prepared talking points and passion. She'd assumed her media fame and progressive credentials would carry her through. She'd thought she could inspire people with her vision without having to defend the details. She was wrong. The exchange proved something important about political communication in the social media age. Twitter followers and Instagram popularity can make you famous. Viral videos can make you influential. But none of that is a substitute for actually knowing what you're talking about. None of that prepares you to answer simple questions about cost, implementation, and consequences. None of that makes you ready to defend policy against someone who's done their homework. Kennedy showed that you don't need to yell or insult people to expose their lack of preparation. You don't need elaborate rhetorical strategies or complex debate tactics. You just need to ask simple questions and refuse to accept non-answers. What does it cost? How will you pay for it? Can you explain this basic concept? Where's your evidence? Simple questions that reveal whether someone has actually thought through their proposals or is just repeating talking points that sound good. AOC couldn't explain costs because she'd never bothered to calculate them. She couldn't defend the Amazon decision because she'd never understood the basic economics of tax breaks. She couldn't explain unemployment statistics because she'd made claims without checking if they were actually true. She couldn't show how to pay for Medicare for all because she'd assumed passion about universal health care was enough without needing a realistic funding plan. And she couldn't point to legislative accomplishments because she'd spent her time on Twitter instead of actually doing the work of legislating. Kennedy's 5 minutes of questioning exposed all of that with devastating clarity. And he did it while being unfailingly polite, speaking slowly with his Louisiana accent, maintaining his simple country lawyer persona right up until the end when he delivered that final summation that left no doubt. He knew exactly what he'd done and why. The hearing room had gone silent as Kennedy delivered his closing words. AOC sat frozen at the witness table, her face a mixture of emotions, anger, humiliation, shock. The cameras captured every moment, every micro-expression, every second of her discomfort. When Kennedy finally yielded his time and sat down, the dam broke. Republicans on the committee burst into applause. Some were trying to maintain decorum, but you could see the smiles, the nods of approval, the glances at each other that said, "Did you see that?" Democrats on the committee looked uncomfortable. Some were stone-faced, trying not to react. Others were clearly sympathetic to AOC but didn't know what to say or do. A few looked genuinely frustrated, whether at Kennedy for his aggressive questioning or at AOC for her poor performance. It was hard to tell. The next senator to question AOC, a Democrat, tried to lob her softball questions to help her recover, to give her a chance to explain herself more fully. But the damage was done. Everyone in that room, everyone watching on television, everyone who would watch the clip later online, had seen what they'd seen. She hadn't been able to answer basic questions about her own policy proposals. That was the story. That was what people would remember. In the days that followed, AOC's team tried various strategies to manage the damage. They released statements claiming Kennedy had been acting in bad faith, that he'd been trying to embarrass a young woman of color, that his questions were designed to make any ambitious policy look impossible. These arguments found some traction among the progressive base, people who were already deeply committed to AOC and her vision. But they didn't work with the broader public, because the video was right there for anyone to watch. Kennedy hadn't been hostile. He hadn't been sexist or racist. He'd been polite, even deferential in his tone. He just asked questions. The fact that those questions were difficult for AOC to answer wasn't evidence of bad faith on his part. It was evidence of lack of preparation on hers. Some progressive commentators tried to argue that Kennedy's focus on costs and details was itself a problem, that it represented a failure to think big, a failure to recognize the urgency of the climate crisis. Why should we have to know the exact cost before we act? They asked. The planet is burning. We need bold action now, not endless debates about numbers. This argument also failed to gain traction outside the progressive bubble, because most Americans, even those who supported action on climate change, thought it was reasonable to want to know how much something would cost before committing to it. Kennedy's questions hadn't been unreasonable. They'd been basic, and the fact that AOC couldn't answer them made people question whether she'd really thought through her proposals or was just making promises that sounded good. AOC herself seemed to struggle with how to respond. In her first interview after the hearing, she was defensive, argumentative, clearly still angry about what had happened. She accused Kennedy of grandstanding, of playing to conservative media, of not being interested in real solutions to climate change. The interviewer, trying to be fair, pointed out that Kennedy had simply asked what her plan would cost and how she'd pay for it. Weren't those reasonable questions? AOC's response was telling. She said that focusing on costs was a way of avoiding action, that politicians had been using concerns about affordability to delay progress for decades, that we couldn't let perfect be the enemy of good. But that wasn't what Kennedy had done. He hadn't demanded perfection. He'd asked for basic information. And by framing his reasonable questions as obstacles to progress, AOC made herself look even more unprepared, even more like someone who wanted to make grand promises without doing the hard work of figuring out how to deliver on them. As the weeks passed, the political implications of the hearing became clearer. AOC's influence within the Democratic Party, never as strong as her media profile suggested, weakened further. Leadership had always been wary of her, seeing her as someone who generated headlines but didn't build coalitions or pass legislation. The Kennedy hearing confirmed their worst fears. She was a liability. She made the party look unserious. She gave Republicans easy attacks. When major climate legislation was being negotiated in the months that followed, AOC wasn't at the table. She wasn't consulted. Her Green New Deal framework wasn't used as the basis for anything. Instead, moderate Democrats worked with some Republicans on more incremental measures, things that could actually pass, things that had real numbers attached to them, things that wouldn't cost so much that they'd terrify voters. AOC complained publicly that she was being sidelined, that the party was ignoring its progressive wing, that incremental measures weren't enough to address the climate crisis. But her complaints rang hollow after the Kennedy hearing. If she wanted to be taken seriously on policy, she needed to do the work. She needed to have answers. She needed to be able to defend her proposals with more than just passion and talking points. Kennedy, meanwhile, became something of a folk hero on the right. Conservative groups started inviting him to speak at events. His questioning technique became the subject of training sessions for young conservative activists. Republicans running for office would cite him as a model for how to engage with progressive policies, ask simple questions, demand real answers, don't let them hide behind rhetoric. He seemed to enjoy his new status, though he maintained that he was just doing his job, just asking the questions any senator should ask when someone proposes to spend trillions of dollars of taxpayer money. In interviews, when asked about the AOC exchange, he was always polite, never gloating. He'd say something like, "I have great respect for Representative Ocasio-Cortez's passion and commitment to the issues she cares about. I just think before we transform the entire American economy, We should probably know what it's going to cost and how we're going to pay for it. That doesn't seem unreasonable to me. And it didn't seem unreasonable to most Americans either. That was the brilliance of Kennedy's approach. He hadn't positioned himself as some partisan warrior trying to destroy a political enemy. He'd positioned himself as a reasonable person asking reasonable questions. The fact that those questions were so difficult for AOC to answer said more about her than it did about him. The hearing also had a broader impact on political discourse, at least for a while. Other politicians, seeing what had happened to AOC, became more careful about making grand promises without having the details worked out. There was a brief period where policy proposals came with actual cost estimates attached, where politicians seemed more willing to engage with questions about implementation rather than just talking about their vision. It didn't last. Politics eventually reverted to form, with politicians of all parties making promises that sounded good without worrying too much about the details. But for a while, Kennedy's questioning of AOC served as a reminder that sometimes the simple questions are the most important ones. What does it cost? How will you pay for it? Have you thought this through? These are the questions voters should be asking. These are the questions journalists should be asking. These are the questions politicians should be able to answer. The fact that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez couldn't answer them in that Senate hearing room on March 12, 2019, became one of the defining moments of her political career. Not because John Kennedy was particularly cruel or unfair, but because he was polite and persistent in asking questions she should have been able to answer easily. And everyone watching could see the difference between someone who'd done their homework and someone who hadn't, between someone who understood policy and someone who just talked about it, between governing and performing. John Kennedy, the Rhodes Scholar playing a simple country lawyer, had taught a masterclass in how to expose unserious policy proposals. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, despite her economics degree and her millions of followers, had learned a hard lesson about the difference between social media popularity and political competence. The cameras captured it all. C-SPAN archived it forever, and millions of Americans watched and learned what happens when passion meets preparation, when rhetoric meets reality, when someone who sounds smart meets someone who actually is smart. Kennedy had won without ever raising his voice. He destroyed her credibility without ever being mean. He'd exposed her lack of preparation while maintaining perfect Southern gentleman courtesy. It was a political execution carried out with a smile and a drawl, and a series of simple questions that anyone should have been able to answer. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez couldn't answer them, and that made all the difference.